Okay, great. Looks like we
Okay,
had
let's try.
minor technical difficulty.
Yeah, let's try that again. That was my fault.
Okay, cool. Well, everyone, welcome to another edition of the Federalist Radio Hour. I'm Emily Dushinsky, joined today by my colleague John Daniel Davidson. John has been talking to sources and investigating claims of voter fraud. And what we want to talk about today is how widespread this voter fraud potentially could be, right? Because what we know so far is that there is clear-cut evidence that it happened. The real question is to what degree? So, John, what have you been hearing over the weekend? You wrote a story on Friday. You chatted with somebody who actually was an election observer in Detroit who had a really interesting story to share. You could just talk a little bit about what you've been hearing from your sources.
Yeah, I talked to someone in Detroit, not a fringe crazy person, but a treasurer, a county treasurer in Southwest Michigan, whose husband is a state senator, and she volunteered to be what they call a poll challenger or a election observer in Detroit because she heard that the Republican Party needed volunteers there. Now, the way it's supposed to work is that you're supposed to have an equal number of Republican and Democratic poll observers to watch them count the absentee ballots to make sure they're following the law. So she went there, and what she described to me was widespread illegal activities happening at the Detroit Convention Center by the election workers, from not allowing Republican poll watchers to be admitted into the counting rooms, to blocking their access to the counting tables, forcing them to stand so far away they couldn't see what was going on. Not only that, but she told me that they were processing absentee ballots that did not meet the criteria in Michigan law to be processed. And when Republican poll challengers issued a challenge on that basis, saying, you guys are counting absentee ballots where the information doesn't match up, they were being ejected, kicked out for doing that. And so over the course of the afternoon, so many GOP poll watchers got kicked out that there was hardly anyone left to observe the absentee ballots being counted. And this was, from what she could tell, this was business as usual there at the convention center. And to be clear, this is the convention center in Detroit where they were counting absentee ballots that had been coming in all through the previous day and afterwards.
Jen, do you know if she's heard anything back from people who would be able to pursue this, or maybe, government officials who would be investigating this in Detroit, or is essentially her only avenue to sharing her story through the press right now?
I think sharing the story with the press was the first step, but there are more steps to come. She couldn't believe what was happening. And she even told me, she said it was unclear who was in charge in the room. Because I was like, who was making decisions about kicking people out? She's like, just election workers, were just making calls saying like, oh, and they were coming up with all kinds of excuses. Like, one, a GOP attorney who was there as a poll watcher adjusted his face mask. And they said, we're kicking you out for, pulling your mask off or whatever. They were using any excuse they could to kick the Republicans out of the room. And she said, while the Republicans poll watchers were in the room, the election workers refused to process absentee ballots. They would just not work if they were being watched by Republican poll watchers. So what is probably going to happen here is that these people's first response in a lot of cases, including the case with this county treasurer, was to talk with the media, to talk with us in this case. The next thing I think that will happen is that they will be contacted by attorneys on behalf of the state or local GOP or public interest law firms, and they will give sworn affidavits about what they saw. And those affidavits will become part of any future lawsuit, or indeed, in the case of many of these states, lawsuits that have already been filed.
Do you have any idea how long that process could? I mean, we're just talking about Michigan right now, and I think it's valuable to sort of jump from state to state and focus on each individual state. Do you know how long that process could take in Michigan? We're talking weeks, presumably, right?
Yeah, I mean, it could take longer than that. I know that there are some states where, automatic recounts have been triggered, and so that process will take a while. But it's clearly going to take longer than the news media and the Democratic Party have patience for. Obviously, we've seen them they've moved on. They don't care about these irregularities. Their line is that there is no evidence of voter fraud when there is evidence of it. It's on tape, it's on video, it's in personal testimony to both to the news media and now in sworn affidavits that are part of these lawsuits. Of course, there's evidence of fraud. There's evidence of fraud in every election. And the difference is, in this election, we had massive mail-in balloting on a scale in some of these states that they've never seen before, opening up for levels of fraud that they've never seen before.
Now, you actually spent some time reporting in Pennsylvania earlier in your career, and so you're familiar with sort of the machine that people have been talking about a lot, particularly in Philadelphia. What insights do you have into how potentially there could be irregularities and there could be fraud occurring in Philadelphia and Pennsylvania more generally?
Yeah, I'll say this. The shortest answer is there are never elections in Philadelphia that are not fraudulent. That doesn't happen. If you have an election in Philadelphia, voter fraud is happening. And it's been that way for 100 years. So it's built into the system. And Christopher Bedford and I wrote an article about this, trying to describe how the machine works and how it's less of a machine than it is like an organism. And I think the line that one person told us in Philadelphia is that an organism doesn't need to be taught how to breathe; it just knows. And that's how the corrupt system in Philadelphia is. As one example, we wrote about this guy Ozzy Myers, who was a character in the American Hustle film in 2013. But he's this incredibly corrupt guy who made it to Congress in the 70s. He got ejected from Congress for trying to bribe FBI agents, and he spent time in prison. And when he got out of prison, he got right back into the business of bribing election judges, and is under indictment right now for efforts to bribe judges in the Pennsylvania Court of Common Pleas, including 3 judges in the Court of Common Pleas in Philadelphia that have not yet been named, at least in public disclosures. But this is the court that the Trump campaign has to go in front of to ask for relief when they encounter allegations of fraud or evidence of misconduct or irregularities. So the bribing of judges is widespread in Philadelphia in particular.
Right. And what's, I think, on a lot of people's minds right now is the media projected a Biden win on Saturday morning. And they essentially are saying, I mean, they may even to some extent acknowledge that there are anecdotes about fraud, but they've said, at this point, none of the court challenges, whatever it is not likely that they'll overcome, the Trump campaign and Trump supporters will overcome the margin that Biden has run up in all of these states. But the media doesn't declare a winner of the presidential election. The government declares a winner of the presidential election. And so what is happening right now in some of these states? There's pending litigation. I know in Pennsylvania, I believe there's some in Michigan and Wisconsin and probably in Arizona. So what's playing out right now is the tabulation process, but even that is being impacted by litigation, correct?
Yeah, nobody knows whether the scale of the fraud was enough to change the outcome. The media can say what it wants, but they don't know. Nobody knows because ballots are still being counted, keep in mind, in a lot of these places. And the process of auditing absentee ballots and recounting them and going back over voter rolls hasn't played out. So nobody knows what they're talking about if they say, oh, there was some anecdotal evidence of fraud, but it wasn't enough to sway the election. And I'll give you a specific example. In Fulton County, Georgia, this is the county that encompasses Atlanta. It's the biggest county in the state. There was a lawsuit that was brought months and months ago, back over the summer, by a law firm there in Atlanta that found 15,000 votes, 15,000 voters in Fulton County who were no longer at the addresses that was listed on the voter rolls and should have been stricken from the voter rolls as eligible for absentee balloting. And the reason this law firm brought this lawsuit back in July wasn't for the presidential election. I just talked to the lawyer a few minutes ago on the phone. The reason they brought it is because they anticipated that there would be a lot of really close state house races in Fulton County, and they wanted those Republican candidates to be able to have access to this information in case of a contested election. And in Georgia, they have rules about when a contested election is automatically triggers a recount. They wanted to have this information about these 15,000 voters who should not be eligible for absentee voting to be on hand for these potentially contested elections. And what they found was that a lot of these people either moved out of state, or they died, or they moved out of Fulton County, but that significant numbers of them voted nevertheless, either out of state or out of Fulton County. So it's clear evidence of voter fraud going on in Fulton County. Why is this important? Because the difference between Donald Trump and Joe Biden in Georgia is something like 11,000 votes right now. It's not a huge margin. So if you have 15,000 voters in Fulton County who shouldn't have been allowed to vote absentee, but many of them did, well, that matters. And is it enough to change the outcome in Georgia? I don't know. Nobody knows. But the margins here are so thin that cases like this are now becoming very important. And this attorney told me, he said, I never imagined that we would be giving this information over for the presidential election. We weren't doing it for that. He's like, I never imagined I would be on the Trump election team now. I just was named to it. He's like, we were doing this for state house elections, but here we are.
Yeah, this is really interesting because that's the central question is, and we started off talking about this, the scale, because there are all of these anecdotes. And you know what? Every election, there are crazy anecdotes about things going wrong. But when you add to the problems that we already have, that, you know, whether or not they're enough to actually change the vote totals significantly is a question. But when you add to that absolute influx of mail voting, I mean, it's kind of a remarkable situation to think about. If you were advising the Trump campaign right now, would you be telling them to do pretty much what they're doing right now? Do you agree with the challenges that they've mounted, or do you agree how they're handling the situation?
Well, I'm no lawyer, but I will say I do agree, and I would agree if the shoe were on the other foot. You know, if it were Biden's team that was down by this much in these states, I would expect and totally understand them mounting challenges too. You know, this is one of the closest presidential elections we've ever had in American history. And it is not just the influx of absentee ballots, it's also all of the changes to state election law on a state-by-state basis that happened over the course of this past year as a response to the pandemic and mostly Democratic calls for expanded absentee balloting. And I'll give you a specific example of this in Georgia. There was a consent decree that was signed by the Georgia Secretary of State, Republican, and the Georgia Democratic Party and a couple other groups, saying that when absentee ballots come in, they don't have to match the signature on the absentee ballot doesn't have to match the signature on the electronic voter database. It only has to match the signature on the absentee ballot application, which, of course, you can see what the problem with that is. If you request an absentee ballot fraudulently, if somebody files all these requests for absentee ballots and with a fraudulent signature, and then they get those ballots, and then they vote and they sign those ballots, of course, those absentee ballots are going to match the signature on the application because it was fraudulent to begin with. For some reason, the Georgia Secretary of State agreed to this months and months ago. And so now that's an issue that's now coming up in Georgia, that they are processing absentee ballots where the signatures don't match up with the signature that's on file. And so this is what I mean. These are these little changes, and they're really obscure. Most people don't follow like election law in specific states and these lawsuits and these consent decrees. The situation in Pennsylvania is very confusing with the Supreme Court stepping in and overruling the state legislature. That's not the kind of stuff that makes national headlines or that like Jake Tapper is going to, you know, explain to you on CNN. But these are the things that may well decide the outcome of this presidential election, given how close it is.
One thing I think a lot of people are starting to consider is perhaps if some of the mistakes were made before the election, as you just alluded to, and that Republicans may not have been happy about some of these changes to state election laws, but for the most part, they were not burning down the house, screaming and waving the red flag to a degree that you might expect given what problems we're facing right now. Is that probably an accurate way to reflect on the lead up to this election, that there were mistakes made before ballots were even cast?
I think that's totally accurate, and I agree that Republicans appear, in certain states, appear to have not fought very hard for the integrity of their elections. Obviously, the state legislature, Republican-controlled state legislature in Pennsylvania, tried to pass some rules and did pass laws governing, when absentee ballots could be counted. State Supreme Court overruled them, and then in the U.S. Supreme Court, didn't intervene and took a hands-off approach. We'll see what happens now, though. They may well get involved now, but I think that's true. I think there's it's just my opinion, but I think there's a hesitancy on the part of elected officials, elected Republicans at the state level, to be seen as trying to suppress the vote. Now, what is one person's opinion might be that you're trying to suppress the vote. Another person might see, well, you're trying to ensure the integrity of the elections and prevent voter fraud. And so I think a lot of these Republicans were kind of like strong-armed and intimidated into supporting measures that compromise the integrity of the election under the guise of not wanting to suppress the vote. But the reality is, as we're now seeing, is that absentee balloting is totally ripe for fraud. It's not hard. It's not, you don't need a sophisticated operation to commit ballot fraud with absentee ballots, especially when they're just mailing them out based on really faulty voter registrations that haven't been updated in years and years.
Have you seen some of the videos? I mean, I think this is one of the most central parts of this entire election that's going to be something that's remembered for years. This is like the time when all of this information is flowing in on social media. Some of the stuff you reported out was first posted to social media by people, and without social media, they would have had a really hard time catching the attention of reporters and getting their stories told, period. But people around the country are looking at these anecdotes of voter fraud, and that kind of amplifies in their mind the scale. And so you have this huge swath of the country seeing all of these anecdotes of voter fraud, and then another huge swath of the country saying that it's all BS and it's nonsense and sort of dismissing it, saying this is anecdotal, it's nothing. But again, we have all of these instances piling up, and we see them. Did you see the videos that people were making where they would type in the name of somebody who was obviously deceased into like the Michigan voter database, and it would come up and show that they had voted in the 2020 election despite having been born in like 1850? Did you see any of those clips?
Yeah, I did, and that it was funny to see that sort of like in Philadelphia and Pennsylvania, especially because, of course, this is like a hallowed tradition in Philadelphia is how often dead people vote. But your point about social media and these videos and sort of these anecdotal evidence building and getting out there is really important. And one example of that, the county treasurer who I interviewed in Michigan, she first came to my attention because she took a video inside the convention hall of election workers cheering, like hooting and hollering and clapping their hands every time a Republican poll watcher was ejected from the building. And she couldn't believe this was happening, that all these election workers would cheer when the people who were supposed to be like legally, who were by law were required to be there, were ejected for these sort of, bullshit reasons. So she surreptitiously took a video on her phone and sent it to her husband, who's a state senator in the Michigan House. And he immediately posted it to Twitter. And it immediately started making the rounds. And, you're not supposed to have your phone on in there, but she did it anyway because she's like, they're breaking all these rules and they're breaking the law, and somebody has to say something and show what's happening here. So she just did it really quickly, and by the time, it was a matter of minutes, and it was out on Twitter. And that's how she came to my attention. I saw that video, and then I got a hold of the senator, and then I got a hold of her. So it's really important that people are able to see what's going on. And I think social media, for all its problems, and technology for all its problems, and I hate social media and technology just as much as the next guy. It is enabling people to see kind of behind the curtain at the the absurd way that we run elections in some of these big cities that is totally rife with fraud. It's not new. And the techniques that they're using to commit fraud aren't new. It's literally like a bin of like blank ballots that are like being filled out. But at least we're getting to see it now. Whereas before, these old machine, democratic machine tricks would happen behind closed doors, would happen out of sight, even though everybody knew it was happening. Now we're actually seeing it happen, and that's a good thing. And hopefully, it's something that makes everybody a little bit suspicious of the way we govern our elections, and suspicious of mass absentee balloting, which is a terrible idea.
Yeah, that makes me, I'm wondering, as somebody who's tracking this, if most of the evidence that we're seeing is coming from the mail-in issue, if it's coming from the observers being kicked out, is it a combination of all of this? Is it dead people voting? Where are we seeing the most evidence of fraud? Where do we appear to have been most vulnerable?
As far as I can tell, it's mail-in ballots. Mail-in ballots just present opportunities for fraud that don't exist with in-person voting, or even with in-person early voting. I'm okay with early voting. I voted early this year myself because I figured I would be busy on election day, but I voted in person. And my vote was tallied there and put into the machine in person. Nobody else handled it. Mail-in balloting every point along the way, and the more I don't usually report on this stuff. I'm not an expert on it, so every day I'm learning more and more as I talk to these people and I talk to these lawyers and these election observers what the process is. And it's you wouldn't believe, like, the chain of custody for mail-in ballots. You would never be allowed to treat like U.S. currency or pharmaceutical or ammo this way. Like there is, in a lot of these places, there's no chain of custody for these mail-in ballots. When they come into the building, where they're kept, are they who has access to them? And that's not just in Detroit. That's like every place you look that has a significant number of mail-in ballots. It's a mess. And I think that's something that the American people are just realizing with this election now, that when you have mass mail-in balloting, you're going to have greater amounts of fraud, just no matter what. You just are, because there's opportunity to commit fraud with mail-in balloting that there's not with in-person balloting. And that's something, by the way, that, like, with these special elections coming up in Georgia and with elections going forward, state legislatures, especially like Republican-controlled state legislatures, if they want to get a handle on this, they need to pass laws like now saying, we're going to restrict mail-in balloting only for those people who really need it. And no, COVID is not an excuse.
Well, this is going forward. A lot of these regulations that were put into place to deal with voting during the era of a pandemic were supported by Democrats because they figured that early voting and mail-in voting would be beneficial to them. But I imagine that if Joe Biden had the exact margins that Hillary Clinton had in 2016, and was just on the other side of this coin, in that these margins are razor thin. However you slice it, there's no like massive mandate. There was no landslide, as some people in the media seem to be anticipating. Do you think that, despite the fact that Democrats pushed for some of these regulations, do you think if the shoe were on the other foot, maybe if we think back to 2000, Democrats would be reacting very differently?
Maybe they would, and maybe they would rethink, the value of mass mail-in voting. But here's the thing: here's why maybe they wouldn't, because where we see the greatest instances of fraud when it comes to mail-in voting are in large cities that have large numbers of votes that have been controlled by Democrats for decades and decades, where these Democratic machines kind of run local elections. And so that's why we talk about places like Detroit, places like Philadelphia, even places like Atlanta. Although Georgia is a conservative state, Fulton County is not. Fulton County is a super majority Democratic voting county. Places like Milwaukee, places that have been Democrat for as long as anyone can remember, and also places where there's been election fraud and really shady dealings for forever. Detroit is a great example. When they initiated a recount in Detroit for the presidential election in 2016, all of the ballots for Wayne County, which is the county where Detroit is, had to be thrown out. They couldn't be part of the recount because the threshold. They were beyond the threshold for ballots that were invalid. And why were the ballots invalid? Because of mass voter fraud that was going on in Detroit. And so you just go back and you research these places, these large cities. They've had problems with election fraud and voter fraud for years and years. The judges, judges have been indicted in these places. People have gone to prison in these places, and not just like back in the 50s or whatever, but like in the last few years. Like election judges have been like charged criminally in Philadelphia for stuffing ballot boxes. Like this happens. This always happens. So it's a long answer to your question, but I think Democrats understand that in these large cities, they have an opportunity to run up the score on elections through fraudulent mail-in votes.
This is something that's really hard for me to wrap my head around, because you just mentioned that judges have literally been indicted for stuffing ballots. And what's just, again, it's hard for me to wrap my head around is the image of a person literally physically stuffing ballots, which is what they're accused of and convicted of in some of these cases. So I'm just trying to like envision how somebody who wanted to modify the vote this cycle, the presidential election results, be they in Detroit, be they in Philly, be they Atlanta, Milwaukee, wherever they are, is that really what we're thinking of right now? And that like there was like, for instance, there have been like random spikes of vote totals on election night and the day after that suddenly went, for Biden in large percentages, and they've been explained away in various ways. But is that literally what the accusation is here, that people are actually stuffing ballots, that they're collecting the names of deceased people and writing them onto ballots right now? What does this actually look like?
In some cases, yes. In some cases, it's a matter of counting mail-in ballots that shouldn't be counted because they don't fit the criteria based on state laws. They should be thrown out and not counted. In other cases, it's bad voter rolls to start with that then in turn enable mail-in ballot fraud, like in Philadelphia, where you have all these dead people that are on the voter rolls, and then they request a mail-in ballot who gets sent to somebody who fills it out on their behalf, and then gets sent in and counted, despite the fact that that person shouldn't have been on the voter roll to begin with. But yeah, it's not like, I said this before, this is not like a high tech, like hackers are into the database. This is old school stuff. Like literally, like the judge that got indicted in Philadelphia last year, he was just paid. They were just paying him. They were paying him to fill out fake ballots. Like it's dumb in a way. Like it's and because it's so straightforward. It's just straightforward corruption for money, ballots for money. That's what it is. And that's what it is in a lot of places. So it'll be interesting to watch these things play out, because there are going to be legal challenges in multiple states. This is not a situation like in 2000 where it was just one state in Florida and we had specific circumstances. This is multiple states, multiple different lawsuits, and a lot of different problems, different kinds of problems in the different states based on what changes they made to their mail-in balloting systems earlier this year, ostensibly as a response to the pandemic, but also looking forward to the presidential election and being able, I think, a lot of Democrats in these places were like, look, if it is close, if it's a close race, we might just be able to commit enough mail-in ballot fraud in these large cities to get us over the line. And I think that may be what we're seeing right now.
And I, again, like just picturing that is so hard for me to wrap my head around but it's obviously been happening for, a century. And particularly when you look at some of these city machines and how they've involved unions and et cetera, et cetera. But to think of that, it's just funny because you said, I think accurately, this isn't a high tech situation. This is like old school, what they've been doing for decades. And to picture that in 2020, it's fascinating. And everybody could have seen this coming. Everybody who wasn't believing that Wisconsin was going to be a 17-point swing for Biden would have known that we were going to have razor thin margins in some of these states where the laws had been changed and there was going to be mass mail-in voting, and that was inevitably going to lead to problems. What would you say to the criticism that Trump supporters right now are essentially sore losers, that are just not taking the L, that are prolonging things sort of needlessly and out of some sort of, desire, last ditch effort? What would you say to that criticism?
The election's not over. That's what I would say. The election's not over. I understand the urge to want it to be over. I want it to be over. But it's not over. It's not over until we get recounts that are required by law, automatic recounts required by law in some of these places. In Wisconsin, there's going to be a recount. In Georgia, there's going to be a recount. And this is just part of the laws that govern elections in these states. And in other cases, there's lawsuits. Be patient, let it play out. The election's not over. Like you said earlier, the media doesn't decide who wins the election. The American people decide, and the election is confirmed through official processes, not because people take to the streets and dance in celebration that that the witch is dead and CNN has called the race. That's not how it works. That's never how it's worked. So I would say it's not a matter of being a sore loser. If all this plays out, and it turns out that despite the fraud, Biden still won enough votes to narrowly win, fine, then Biden won. And we can have confidence that the election had integrity. But I don't think anybody thinks that the election has integrity right now. The Republicans are open about the fact that they think there's fraud. Democrats, in their heart of hearts, know that the election has fraud in these places. They're just not capable of saying it, but they know. Of course they know. So I would just say it's not a matter of being a sore loser. It's just a matter of the fact that the election is not over yet.
I want to close out on some of the maybe broader cultural implications of this battle that is raging on and will presumably go on for weeks, if not months, because the recount process doesn't even in and of itself necessarily address some of the fraud allegations, because it's just recounting votes that were cast as opposed to, actually investigating how those votes were cast or who cast them. This is a time when, particularly during the pandemic and certainly before the pandemic, we saw, cratering distrust in our institutions in this country. A lot of that accelerated over the course of the pandemic. And now we're at a situation where the incumbent is projected by the media to have lost the presidential election by a very thin margin. And in a case where mail-in voting was, happened in such large numbers that people don't trust the election results. And so, whatever you think about how this process is playing out, or who really won, or who would have won, you have a huge part of the country right now that feels as though the election results have not been legitimately validated, and the media is rushing to do it, and perhaps that there was serious widespread fraud in some of these states that they may believe swung the election results. What do you think that does to the system? Because there are a lot of Biden voters who are probably perfectly content with the results and think everything is great and aren't super concerned about election fraud, dismiss some of the stuff as anecdotal evidence, and maybe it is. But you have Biden voters thinking one way, and then you have Trump supporters thinking another way. And those are both two huge groups of the country. So what do you think this does to the process and to the country going forward?
It's horrible. It's the worst possible thing that could have happened in this election. It would have been better probably in the long term for the country, for our cohesion as a republic, if Biden had just won in a landslide. Now, of course, if Biden had won in a landslide, that would have been the end of the republic, because he would have had a mandate to dismantle the republic and turn it into a progressive direct democracy utopia. But no, this is a terrible outcome, because no matter what happens now, half the country is going to think that the election was invalid. And we already saw in 2016 that Democrats did not accept the results of the election. They did not accept that that Trump won. You had Hillary Clinton coming out and calling him an illegitimate president, right after he won the election, after she conceded. And so this is a long-term problem. The decline in trust in our institutions is a long-term problem. I don't know that there's a solution for it, but things like this election, and all these instances of fraud, and the media's rush to call it for Biden, and also like their ugly sort of wallowing in condescension and contempt for Trump voters after 71 million people voted for Trump. It is poisoning public life in this country. It will continue to poison public life in this country, and it raises questions about, can we have national elections anymore after the last two, where half the country basically just rejected the results? Can we have a national election in this country that we all accept, where we all just accept the results of it? There's a lot of Trump voters who are not going to accept the results of this election, and they're probably going to have a decent reason to, if we don't see this process through, and we don't have these recounts, and we don't have accountability for the mail-in voting fraud that we know is happening. There's going to be a lot of Trump voters who are just going to lose faith in elections completely. So I don't say that that's a really sad state of affairs, and I don't know that there's a solution for it. But the worst thing that could have happened for the institutions of this country in our public life is what just happened in this election.
That's exactly the direction that I was going in. I saw a tweet from somebody over the weekend that said something to the effect of, the election was illegitimate, or voter fraud is the right's new version of Russiagate. And I think that's wildly premature. And I think it's kind of smug, but I think there is a serious risk. And it's hard to actually, this is where I think there's a difference between, people who are fair-minded about these things and the kind of hyperventilating, hysterical media, is that you have to understand, if you're not too out of touch, you have to understand that people actually have good reasons to distrust their institutions. And one of those reasons is that we have this mass mail-in voting at a huge scale. There's anecdotal evidence of fraud, and the media is totally dismissing all of it and glossing over it. And that's exactly the recipe you have for creating a Russiagate on the right. And of course, people have to do their own due diligence and come to the right conclusions. And American people, we should put enough responsibility and trust in them to be able to do that well. But the media is creating a situation. They're literally they're sowing distrust in the institutions that they're telling everybody that blindly they must trust. And this is such a great example of that, in that, if you want to know why people are susceptible to things like QAnon, and why people are susceptible to things like, swallowing the idea that there's massive voter fraud and Donald Trump is the real winner of the election, whatever, if you want to know what happens, it's because institutions are lying to them.
Yeah. I couldn't have put it better myself. That's the reason. You're going to have a lot more believers in QAnon after this. I can tell you that.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. And this is a great place to end it on. Not an optimistic or a happy place to end the conversation, but an appropriate one nonetheless. John, thank you so much for stopping by today.
Thanks for having me. My pleasure.
That's John Daniel Davidson. He's a politics editor at the Federalist. You can follow him on Twitter at John D. Davidson. Is that it?
That's it.
There it is, John D. Davidson. Follow us, the Federalist, on Twitter at FDRLST. Like and subscribe on YouTube. We will be back soon with more. I'm Emily Drushinsky. Until we're back, be lovers of freedom and anxious for the fray.